Good evening, and welcome back to the Sleep Library. Tonight, we journey into the quiet corridors of medieval monasteries, where knowledge was preserved through centuries of patient dedication. In these sacred halls, monks devoted their lives to the gentle art of copying manuscripts, one careful letter at a time. Our story unfolds slowly, like the turning of ancient parchment pages. We'll explore the hushed scriptoriums where candlelight flickered against stone walls, the methodical routines that governed monastic life, and the gradual accumulation of wisdom that would shape the medieval world. Let yourself settle in as we discover the peaceful world of medieval monastery libraries, where time moved at the pace of a carefully drawn illuminated letter, and knowledge grew as slowly and surely as ivy on monastery walls. In the fading light of the Roman Empire, the cities crumbled and roads fell into disrepair. A different kind of community began to take shape in the countryside of Europe. These were the monasteries, places where men and women withdrew from the world to dedicate their lives to prayer, contemplation, and the preservation of knowledge. The earliest monastic communities were simple affairs. Picture, if you will, a collection of modest stone buildings arranged around a central courtyard. The morning mist clings to the low walls as the first bell of the day calls the brothers to prayer. Their footsteps echo softly on one stone paths as they make their way to the chapel, their breath visible in the cool dawn air. Saint Benedict of Nursia, writing in the 6th century, established the rule that would govern monastic life for centuries to come. His guidelines were gentle but firm, emphasizing the importance of ora et labora, pray and work. Among the various labors assigned to the monks, none would prove more enduring or significant than the copying of manuscripts. In these early monasteries, books were precious beyond measure. A single volume might represent months or even years of painstaking labor. The materials alone were costly parchment made from carefully prepared animal skins, inks mixed from minerals and plant dyes, and binding materials that had to be imported from distant lands. The monastery of Cassiodorus in southern Italy stands as one of the earliest examples of institutional dedication to learning. Founded in the 6th century, it housed a remarkable collection of both Christian and classical texts. Cassiodorus himself understood the fragility of knowledge and the importance of preservation. He established workshops where monks could learn not only to copy texts, but also to repair and rebind ancient volumes. The daily routine in these early scriptoriums followed the natural rhythm of light and shadow. Work began shortly after the morning prayers, when the first pale light of dawn provided enough illumination for the careful work ahead. Monks would take their places at simple wooden desks, arranging their materials with the practiced efficiency of long habit, a piece of parchment stretched taut, reed pens carefully cut and prepared, small pots of ink within easy reach. The work itself demanded extraordinary patience and attention to detail. Each letter had to be formed with precision, each word carefully spaced, each line perfectly aligned. A single page might take an entire day to complete, and a full manuscript could require months or even years of steady labor. The scriptorium was maintained in near-perfect silence. The only sounds were the gentle scratching of pens on parchment, the soft rustle of pages being turned, and the occasional creak of wooden chairs as scribes shifted position. This quiet atmosphere was not merely practical, it was considered essential to the spiritual nature of the work. As the morning progressed, shafts of sunlight would move slowly across the stone floor, marking the passage of time more surely than any clock. The monks learned to work with this natural rhythm, positioning themselves to take advantage of the best light while protecting their delicate materials from direct sun that might fade the inks or crack the parchment. The rule of Saint Benedict specified that each monk should spend a portion of his day in manual labor, another portion in prayer, and several hours in reading and study. This balance created a community where literacy was not just encouraged but required. Every monk had to be able to read Latin fluently, and many developed skills in writing and copying as well. The texts chosen for copying in these early monasteries reflected the priorities of Christian learning. The Bible, of course, held the place of highest honor, but monks also preserved works of the Church Fathers, commentaries on Scripture, and collections of prayers and hymns. Gradually, as communities grew more confident and resources permitted, they began to copy classical texts as well works of history, natural philosophy, and even poetry that might otherwise have been lost forever. The physical layout of the early monastery library was often quite simple. Books might be stored in a wooden chest in the church itself, or in a small room adjacent to the scriptorium. Access was carefully controlled, with the librarian monk often called the armarius responsible for the care and distribution of volumes. Each book was precious enough to be chained to its shelf or reading desk, a practice that would continue for centuries. The binding of these early manuscripts was itself an art form requiring considerable skill. Wooden boards were covered with leather, often decorated with simple tooled patterns. Metal clasps held the books closed, protecting the pages from dust and damage. Some volumes, particularly those intended for use during religious services, might be bound with more elaborate material, silk, precious metals, or even gems donated by wealthy patrons. The work of preservation extended beyond simply copying texts. Monks developed techniques for repairing damaged parchment, mixing new inks when old ones faded, and rebinding volumes whose original bindings had deteriorated. They became skilled in the chemistry of preservation, learning which materials would endure and which would crumble with age. The monastery of Monte Cassino, founded by Saint Benedict himself, became a model for institutions throughout Europe. Its library, though destroyed and rebuilt multiple times over the centuries, represented the ideal of monastic learning, a place where ancient wisdom was preserved through patient, methodical labor, where each day brought small but significant additions to the store of human knowledge. As evening approached and the light began to fade, the monks would carefully clean their pens, keep their ink pots, and cover their work with clean cloths. The day's labor was done, but the great work of preservation would continue tomorrow, and the day after that, extending far into the future like a slow but steady river carrying the treasures of the past toward generations yet unborn. The heart of any monastery dedicated to learning was its scriptorium, the sacred space where manuscripts were copied, illuminated, and preserved. These rooms were designed with the specific needs of scribes in mind, balancing practical considerations with the spiritual atmosphere that monks required for their contemplative work. A typical scriptorium occupied the quietest part of the monastery complex, often positioned to catch the morning and afternoon sun while being sheltered from the harsh midday glare. The windows were large by medieval standards, sometimes equipped with shutters that could be adjusted to control the light. In the finest scriptoriums, these windows might even contain small panes of glass, an enormous luxury in the early medieval period, while others made do with stretched parchment or oilcloth that admitted light while keeping out the weather. The floor of the scriptorium was usually stone, covered with rushes or simple woven mats that could absorb ink spills and provide some warmth for feet that might remain still for hours at a time. The walls were thick stone, which helped maintain a steady temperature and protected the precious manuscripts from the dampness that could destroy months of careful work. Along these walls stood the scribe's desk, simple but carefully constructed pieces of furniture that would serve their users for decades. Each desk was positioned to take advantage of natural light, typically angled so that shadows would not fall across the work surface. The height was crucial. Too high, and the scribe would strain his shoulders and neck. Too low, and his back would ache from bending over his work. The desk itself was usually made of oak or another hardwood, polished smooth by years of use. Its surface was often covered with a piece of soft leather or felt to cushion the parchment and provide a stable writing surface. Small holes drilled into the desktop held inkpots securely in place, preventing accidents that could destroy hours of careful work. Each scribe's workspace was equipped with the essential tools of his trade, arranged with the precision of a ritual. The penknife, used for cutting and shaping quill pens, lay within easy reach. Beside it might rest a small whetstone for keeping the blade sharp, and a piece of pumice for smoothing rough spots on parchment. The preparation of writing materials was itself a meditative process. Quill pens had to be carefully selected from the wing feathers of geese, swans, or other large birds. The finest quills came from the primary flight feathers, which provided the proper curve and flexibility for extended writing. Each quill required careful preparation, the tip cut to a precise angle, the shaft sometimes hardened by brief exposure to heat, the barrel hollowed to hold an appropriate amount of ink. Ink preparation was perhaps the most complex aspect of the scribe's craft. The basic black ink used for most text was made from oak galls, irregular growths that form on oak trees in response to wasp larvae. These galls were ground to a fine powder and mixed with iron sulfate and gum arabic, creating a deep black ink that would darken with age rather than fade. Red ink, used for headings and initial letters, was made from cinnabar or red lead. Blue came from lapis lazuli, ground to an incredibly fine powder and mixed with egg white or gum arabic. Gold ink, reserved for the most precious manuscripts, was created by grinding gold leaf with honey and gum, producing a lustrous finish that would gleam in candlelight for centuries. The parchment itself was prepared through a long and laborious process that began with the careful selection of animal skins. Calfskin produced the finest parchment, known as vellum, while sheepskin and goatskin were used for more common manuscripts. The skins were soaked in lime water for days or weeks to remove hair and flesh, then stretched on wooden frames and scraped thin with curved knives. The finished parchment was rubbed with pumice to create a smooth writing surface, then cut to size and marked with light lines to guide the scribe's work. This ruling was done with a sharp stylus that created barely visible indentations in the parchment lines that would guide the placement of text, but would not interfere with the final appearance of the page. In the scriptorium, each monk had his assigned place, often the same seat he had occupied for years or even decades. The most experienced scribes worked on the finest manuscripts, while novices might begin with simple practice texts or the preparation of materials. The master of the scriptorium, often called the librarian or armarius, moved quietly among the workers, checking their progress and offering guidance when needed. The furniture of the scriptorium reflected both practical needs and monastic ideals of simplicity. Besides the writing desks, there were tall lecterns where large volumes could be consulted, storage chests for parchment and writing materials, and shelves for works in progress. A few chairs with backs provided relief for scribes whose work required particular concentration, though most monks worked standing at slanted desks that promoted good posture and steady hands. Lighting was always a concern in the scriptorium. During the day, natural light was preferred, but as autumn and winter days grew shorter, scribes had to rely on artificial illumination. Candles were expensive and produced smoke that could damage manuscripts, so oil lamps were often preferred. These were carefully positioned to provide steady light without creating dangerous shadows or heat that might warp parchment. The rhythm of work in the scriptorium followed the natural cycles of light and season. In summer, scribes might work from dawn until late afternoon, taking breaks for prayer and meals as prescribed by the rule. Winter days were shorter, but the work continued by lamplight when necessary, particularly when important commissions had to be completed by specific deadlines. Temperature control was another constant concern. Too much heat could make inks flow unevenly and cause parchment to curl. Too much cold could make fingers stiff and inks thick and difficult to work with. The scriptorium often had a small fireplace or brazier that could provide gentle warmth on the coldest days, carefully positioned so that smoke and sparks could not reach the work areas. The tools of illumination, the decoration of manuscripts with elaborate initial letters and marginalia required even more specialized equipment. Fine brushes made from sable or squirrel hair, tiny dishes for mixing pigments, and burnishing tools made from polished bone or stone all had their places in the illuminator's kit. Gold leaf required special handling, with sheets so thin they would flutter away at the slightest breath, applied with brushes so fine they contained only a few hairs. Storage of work in progress presented its own challenges. Completed sheets had to be kept flat and clean, protected from dust and insects that might damage the careful work. Wooden boards covered with clean cloth served as temporary storage, while completed sections of larger works might be rolled and stored in wooden tubes lined with silk or linen. The scriptorium was more than just a workspace. It was a place of spiritual significance, where the preservation of knowledge was understood as a form of prayer. The silence that pervaded these rooms was not merely practical, but sacred, a recognition that the work being done there was part of a larger divine purpose. In this quiet atmosphere, surrounded by the tools of their ancient craft, medieval scribes carried forward the great tradition of learning that would illuminate the centuries to come. In the pre-dawn darkness of the monastery, the first bell would sound across the silent courtyards, calling the community to Lauds, the morning prayer that marked the beginning of each monastic day. For the scribes who would spend their hours copying and preserving manuscripts, this moment began a carefully choreographed routine that had been refined over centuries. Brother Thomas, let us call him, had been a scribe at the Abbey of St. Gall for 15 years. His hands, permanently stained with ink, moved automatically as he dressed in the darkness of his cell. The woolen habit, rough against his skin, had become as familiar as breathing. His fingers, grown sensitive to the texture of parchment and the weight of a properly prepared quill, fumbled briefly with the rope belt that marked him as one sworn to poverty. The chapel was already filling with the quiet rustle of robes and the soft padding of sandaled feet when Thomas arrived. In the flickering light of oil lamps, he could make out the familiar faces of his brother Marcus, whose skill with gold leaf was renowned throughout the region. Brother Augustine, the keeper of the library who knew the location of every manuscript in their collection. Young Brother Peter, still learning to cut a proper pen. The prayers themselves formed part of the rhythm that would govern the scribe's day. The Latin phrases, worn smooth by countless repetitions, created a meditative state that would carry forward into their work. The rise and fall of voices in unison, the measured cadences of ancient hymns, all contributed to the sense of timelessness that pervaded monastic life. After Lauds came the first meal of the day, a simple affair of bread, ale, and perhaps cheese during times when the rule permitted. The scribes ate quickly and in silence, their minds already turning to the work ahead. Thomas had been copying a Psalter for 3 months now, and he could feel the weight of unfinished pages waiting for his attention. The walk from the refectory to the scriptorium was brief, but it provided a moment of transition from the communal activities of prayer and meals to the solitary concentration required for manuscript work. Thomas paused at the entrance to the scriptorium, as he had every morning for 15 years, offering a brief silent prayer for steady hands and clear eyes. Inside the scriptorium, each scribe had his designated place, arranged by the master librarian according to experience and the nature of current projects. Thomas's desk occupied a position near the eastern windows, where the morning light would provide the best illumination for the detailed work of his Psalter. The desktop, polished smooth by years of use, held the familiar arrangement of tools. Inkpots filled the previous evening, quill pens cut and ready, a supply of pumice for corrections, and the curved knife used for shaping pen points. The parchment for the day's work lay ready, marked with the faintest of ruled lines to guide the placement of text. Thomas had prepared these sheets himself the previous afternoon, checking each one for flaws that might cause his pen to catch or blot. The art of selecting good parchment had taken years to master, learning to feel for the proper thickness, to spot potential weak spots, to judge how different surfaces would accept ink. As the morning light strengthened, Thomas began his work. The first task was always the careful examination of the exemplar, the manuscript from which he was copying. This particular psalter was written in a clear Carolingian minuscule, the standard script that had been developed in the court scriptoriums of Charlemagne 2 centuries earlier. Each letter was formed according to strict rules that Thomas had memorized so thoroughly they had become second nature. The actual process of copying required a particular kind of concentration that was both intense and relaxed. Thomas would read a phrase or sentence from the exemplar, holding it in his mind while his hand formed the letters on the new parchment. The rhythm was important to fast, and errors would creep in. Too slow, and the mind would wander, leading to inconsistent letter formation or spacing. The scratching of pen on parchment created a gentle, steady sound that filled the scriptorium. Occasionally, one of the scribes would pause to recut a pen that had begun to write roughly, or to mix a fresh batch of ink. These small interruptions were part of the natural rhythm of the work, like the breathing spaces in a long prayer. Brother Marcus, working at a desk near Thomas, was engaged in the delicate task of adding illuminated initials to a gospel book. His work required even greater concentration, as a single misplaced stroke could ruin hours of careful preparation. Marcus would spend the entire morning on a single large initial, building up layers of color and gold leaf with infinite patience. The division of labor in the scriptorium reflected both practical considerations and individual talents. Some monks specialized in the basic copying of text, developing the speed and consistency necessary to produce multiple copies of important works. Others, like Marcus, focused on illumination and decoration. Still others became experts in particular subjects, responsible for checking the accuracy of copies and making necessary corrections. Young Brother Peter represented the future of the scriptorium. He had entered the monastery 3 years earlier and was still learning the fundamental skills of manuscript production. His mornings were spent practicing letter formation on wax tablets that could be smoothed and reused, gradually developing the muscle memory that would allow him to work with confidence on precious parchment. The teaching of scribal skills was itself a carefully structured process. Novices began by learning to prepare materials, cutting pens, mixing inks, ruling parchment. Only when these basic tasks were mastered were they allowed to attempt actual copying, beginning with simple text that could be redone if necessary. The progression from novice to master scribe typically took 7 to 10 years, a reflection of the high standards maintained in monastic scriptoriums. Midday brought a break in the work as the bells called the community to sext, the 6th-hour prayer. The scribes covered their work carefully to protect it from dust and insects, cleaned their pens, and joined their brothers in the chapel. The rhythm of prayer provided natural breaks in the workday, preventing the kind of sustained effort that might lead to errors or fatigue. After the noon meal, work resumed, but the afternoon brought different challenges. The light was stronger but more variable as clouds moved across the sun. Thomas had learned to work with these changes, adjusting his position slightly to maintain consistent illumination on his parchment. The afternoon was also warmer, which meant that inks might flow differently and parchment might respond to changes in humidity. The social dynamics of the scriptorium were subtle but important. While the rule prescribed silence during work, there were moments when quiet consultation was necessary, when a word in the exemplar was unclear, when a correction needed to be made, or when advice was sought on a technical problem. These exchanges were conducted in whispers or through gestures developed over years of working together. As the day progressed, fatigue became a factor that had to be managed carefully. The fine work of manuscript copying required steady hands and clear vision, both of which could deteriorate as muscles tired and eyes strained. Experienced scribes learned to recognize the signs of fatigue and would pause for brief exercises, stretching fingers, rolling shoulders, looking up from their work to rest their eyes. The end of the workday came with vespers, the evening prayer that marked the transition from labor to rest. Thomas covered his work for the final time, cleaned his tools with the careful attention they deserved, and prepared materials for the following day. The unfinished Psalter would wait patiently through the night, its completion one day closer. In the evening, after Compline, the final prayer of the day, there might be time for reading in the library or quiet conversation with fellow scribes. These moments provided opportunities to discuss techniques, share discoveries from the texts they were copying, or simply enjoy the companionship of those who understood the peculiar rewards and challenges of their calling. Brother Thomas's day ended as it had begun, in the silence of his cell. His fingers, still slightly curved from holding a pen, would rest until tomorrow brought another day of patient copying, another small contribution to the great work of preserving knowledge for future generations. In the darkness, he could hear the soft breathing of his sleeping brothers, each one a part of the quiet community that had dedicated itself to keeping the light of learning alive in a world often shadowed by ignorance and loss. Within the hushed confines of medieval monastery libraries, an extraordinary diversity of texts found sanctuary. Each manuscript represented not merely a collection of words, but a deliberate choice about what knowledge deserved preservation, what wisdom should be passed to future generations, and what stories would continue to illuminate the human experience. The Bible, naturally, held the position of highest honor in any monastic collection, but even this most sacred of texts appeared in numerous forms, each serving different purposes within the monastic community. The great Lectern Bibles, written in large, clear scripts on the finest vellum, were designed for public reading during religious services. These massive volumes, sometimes requiring 2 monks to lift them, were often the most beautifully decorated manuscripts in the entire monastery. Brother Alcuin, the keeper of manuscripts at the Abbey of Corvey, could distinguish between dozens of different types of biblical texts simply by their size and appearance. The small pocket Gospels, copied in minute but perfectly legible scripts, were carried by traveling monks and missionaries. These portable books had to balance readability with portability, their compact size achieved through careful abbreviations and economical use of parchment. Psalters formed another crucial category of biblical manuscript. These collections of the Psalms of David served multiple purposes. They were used in private devotion, in the daily cycle of monastic prayers, and as teaching texts for young monks learning to read Latin. The layout of psalters followed established conventions. Each psalm began with an ornate initial letter. Verses were carefully numbered, and special notations indicated where musical accompaniment should be added. The copying of liturgical books required particularly specialized knowledge. Missals, containing the prayers and readings for the celebration of Mass, had to be absolutely accurate. An error in such a manuscript could affect the spiritual life of an entire community. Graduals and antiphoners, containing the musical portions of religious services, presented unique challenges as scribes had to master the notation systems used to record Gregorian chant. Beyond the purely biblical texts lay an extensive literature of Christian theology and commentary. The works of the Church Fathers Augustine, Jerome, Gregory the Great, and others formed the intellectual foundation of medieval Christianity. These texts were copied and recopied countless times, as each monastery sought to build a complete theological library. Augustine's Confessions was among the most frequently copied works, its deeply personal exploration of faith and doubt resonating with generations of monks. Jerome's biblical commentaries provided essential guidance for understanding Scripture, while Gregory the Great's pastoral rule offered practical advice for spiritual leadership. Each of these works required careful copying, as theological errors could have serious consequences for the religious community. The preservation of classical literature within monastery walls represents one of the most remarkable aspects of medieval scholarship. Monks copying the works of Virgil, Ovid, or Cicero might not have fully approved of the pagan content, yet they recognized the literary and educational value of these texts. The survival of much classical literature is due entirely to the patient work of monastic scribes who copied these works, even when their content conflicted with Christian teaching. Virgil's Aeneid was particularly popular in monastic libraries, perhaps because its themes of destiny and divine purpose could be interpreted in Christian terms. Of its metamorphoses, despite its often sensual content, was preserved because of its encyclopedic knowledge of classical mythology. Cicero's rhetorical works were valued as models of Latin prose style, essential for monks who needed to write letters, legal documents, or theological treatises. The monastery of Fulda, under the leadership of Abbot Rabanus Maurus, developed one of the most comprehensive classical collections in medieval Europe. Here, monks copied not only the major works of Latin literature, but also preserved fragments of texts that existed nowhere else. The careful cataloguing system developed at Fulda became a model for other monastic libraries throughout the Carolingian Empire. Historical works formed another significant category of manuscript preservation. The chronicles and annals produced in monasteries served as the primary historical records of medieval Europe. These texts began as simple lists of important events: the death of kings, the occurrence of eclipses, the outcomes of battles, but gradually evolved into sophisticated historical narratives. Bede's ecclesiastical history of the English people, written at the monastery of Jarrow in the 8th century, established the standard for medieval historical writing. Copies of this work could be found in monasteries throughout Europe, each one carefully transcribed and sometimes updated with local information. The preservation and transmission of such historical works required scribes who understood not only the craft of copying, but also the significance of the events being recorded. Medical and scientific texts represented a more practical aspect of monastic manuscript collections. Monasteries often served as centers of healing for surrounding communities, and their libraries reflected this responsibility. Greek medical texts, translated into Latin, preserved the knowledge of Hippocrates and Galen. Herbals described the medicinal properties of plants, often illustrated with careful drawings that helped identify specific species. The Herbarium of Pseudo Apuleius was among the most frequently copied medical texts in monastic libraries. Its combination of plant descriptions, medical recipes, and magical formulas reflected the complex medieval understanding of healing. Scribes copying such texts had to be particularly careful with dosages and preparation instructions, as errors could literally mean the difference between life and death. Legal texts formed another crucial category of monastic manuscripts. Canon law, governing the internal affairs of the church, required careful preservation and regular updating as new papal decrees were issued. Civil law, particularly the Justinian Code, was studied and copied in monasteries that served as centers of legal education. The diversity of scripts used in different types of manuscripts reflects both practical considerations and cultural traditions. Biblical texts were often written in the most formal scripts available, emphasizing their sacred nature. Classical texts might be copied in scripts that echoed the traditions of ancient Rome, while legal documents required clear, unambiguous letter forms that would prevent misinterpretation. Brother Notka, working in the scriptorium of St. Gall, specialized in the production of musical manuscripts. These required not only perfect textual accuracy, but also precise placement of musical notation. The development of staff notation during the 11th and 12th centuries revolutionized the copying of musical texts, allowing for much more accurate preservation of melodic content. The physical appearance of manuscripts also varied significantly according to their intended use. Service books had to be large enough to be read by multiple people in dim church lighting. Personal prayer books could be much smaller, designed to be carried in a monk's traveling pack. Reference works like biblical concordances needed clear organization and extensive cross-referencing systems. The gradual accumulation of these diverse texts created monastery libraries that were truly encyclopedic in scope. A well-established monastery might house several hundred manuscripts covering virtually every area of medieval knowledge. The careful organization and cataloging of these collections required sophisticated systems that anticipated the needs of future scholars and preserved the intellectual heritage of past generations. In the quiet hours when Brother Alcuin walked among the shelves of the Corvey Library, he could see the accumulated wisdom of centuries arranged in careful order. Each manuscript represented countless hours of patient labor, from the preparation of parchment to the final binding of completed volumes. Together, they formed a treasury of knowledge that would serve not only the immediate monastic community, but also scholars and students for generations to come. The preservation of this diverse collection of texts required constant vigilance and regular maintenance. Manuscripts had to be checked for signs of deterioration, rebound when necessary, and carefully protected from the elements that could destroy years of painstaking work. In carrying out these responsibilities, medieval monastic librarians served as the guardians of human knowledge, ensuring that the wisdom of the past would continue to illuminate the future. In the gentle light that filtered through the tall windows of the scriptorium, Brother Matthias prepared for what many considered the most sacred aspect of manuscript creation, the art of illumination. His desk, positioned to catch the steadiest morning light, held an array of materials that would have impressed even the finest secular artists of his time. Tiny pots of ground pigments, sheets of gold leaf so delicate they seemed to float, brushes made from the finest sable hairs, and small tools carved from bone and ivory. The manuscript before him, a Gospel of Matthew commissioned by the abbey for presentation to a visiting bishop, already contained the carefully copied text, the work of Brother Anselm, whose reputation for accuracy was known throughout the region. Now it fell to Matthias to transform these pages from mere text into works of art that would inspire devotion and wonder for centuries to come. The tradition of manuscript illumination had evolved slowly over several centuries, beginning with simple decorative initials and gradually developing into complex artistic programs that could take months or even years to complete. The term illumination itself referred to the way these decorated manuscripts seemed to glow within a light, their gold and silver details catching and reflecting the flames of candles and oil lamps. Matthias began each project with careful planning, sketching preliminary designs on wax tablets that could be smoothed and reused. The layout of each page required precise calculation, the size and position of initial letters, the placement of marginal decorations, the integration of text and image into a harmonious whole. These preliminary sketches would be refined and adjusted until every element worked together in perfect balance. The preparation of pigments was itself a complex art that required both technical knowledge and considerable patience. The deep blue that would color the Virgin's robe in the Annunciation scene came from lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone imported at great expense from the mountains of Afghanistan. The stone had to be ground to an incredibly fine powder, then mixed with egg white or gum arabic to create a paint that would flow smoothly from the brush while maintaining its brilliant color. Red pigments came from several sources, each with its own characteristics and uses. Vermilion, made from cinnabar, provided a bright orange red perfect for decorative borders and clothing. Red lead offered a different shade, more orange in tone, often used for backgrounds and architectural details. For the most luxurious manuscripts, red might come from kermes, tiny insects harvested from oak trees, ground and processed to create a deep crimson that would not fade over time. Yellow presented its own challenges. Orpiment, an arsenic-based mineral, provided brilliant golden yellows, but was dangerous to handle and incompatible with many other pigments. Saffron, derived from crocus flowers, offered a more subtle yellow that was perfectly safe, but enormously expensive. For most purposes, yellow ochre, made from common earth pigments, provided a reliable if less spectacular solution. Green was perhaps the most difficult color to achieve successfully. Verdigris, made from copper corrosion, provided brilliant green tones that had a tendency to eat through parchment over time. Malachite, ground from the mineral of the same name, was more stable but expensive and difficult to obtain. Many illuminators mixed their own greens from blue and yellow pigments, accepting a somewhat less intense color in exchange for greater longevity. The application of gold was the culmination of the illuminator's art. Gold leaf, beaten to incredible thinness, had to be handled with extraordinary care. The slightest breath could send a sheet fluttering away, and static electricity could cause the delicate metal to cling to fingers or tools. Matthias had learned to work with gold in the early morning, when the air was still and humid, and his movements had become as precise and controlled as those of a surgeon. Before gold could be applied, the parchment had to be prepared with a special base called bole, a mixture of clay and glue that provided the proper surface for the metal to adhere. This base was brushed on in thin layers, allowed to dry, then polished with soft cloth until it achieved a perfect smoothness. Only then could the gold leaf be laid down, pressed gently into place, and burnished with polished bone tools until it gleamed like solid metal. The iconography of manuscript illumination followed well-established conventions that had been refined over centuries. Initial letters at the beginning of important sections were transformed into complex architectural fantasies, populated with saints, angels, and symbolic animals. The letter B that began the book of Genesis might sprout branches and leaves, populated with birds and small animals that represented the diversity of God's creation. Marginal decorations evolved from simple geometric patterns into elaborate fantasies that sometimes seemed to have lives of their own. Vines and tendrils sprouted from initial letters, wandering around the margins and supporting flowers, fruits, and small figures. These marginal creatures, called drolleries by modern scholars, included both realistic animals and fantastic beasts drawn from medieval bestiary traditions. The integration of text and image required careful planning and considerable artistic skill. Full-page miniatures, depicting scenes from the life of Christ or the saints, had to be composed so that they enhanced rather than distracted from the written word. The proportions of figures, the arrangement of architectural settings, and the use of color all had to serve the greater purpose of inspiring religious devotion. Brother Matthias had studied the great illuminated manuscripts in his monastery's collection, learning from the masters who had come before him. The Book of Kells, though created centuries earlier in Ireland, remained a source of inspiration for its incredible intricacy and symbolic depth. Carolingian manuscripts from the court workshops of Charlemagne showed how classical artistic traditions could be adapted to Christian purposes. The process of creating a single illuminated page might take weeks or even months to complete. Each stage required different skills and presented unique challenges. The underdrawing, sketched lightly in silver point or charcoal, established the composition and proportions. The application of base colors came next, building up areas of blue, red, and green in careful layers. Details were added gradually: facial features, drapery folds, architectural elements, each one requiring steady hands and perfect concentration. The monastery's collection of artistic tools reflected the specialized nature of illumination work. Brushes ranged from tiny implements with only a few hairs used for the finest details, to broader brushes for laying in background colors. Ruling pens created the precise lines needed for architectural details and decorative borders. Compasses and straightedges ensured accurate geometric patterns, while special burnishing tools made from polished agate or bloodstone brought gold leaf to its brilliant final luster. The symbolic content of illuminated manuscripts reflected the medieval understanding of the world as a book written by God, where every creature and object carried deeper spiritual meaning. A simple flower in the margin might represent the Virgin Mary, while a pelican feeding her young symbolized Christ's sacrifice for humanity. Lions represented both the power of God and the dangers of worldly temptation, depending on their context within the composition. Color itself carried symbolic weight in medieval illumination. Blue, the most expensive pigment, was reserved for the robes of the Virgin Mary and other figures of supreme holiness. Red might represent either the blood of martyrdom or the flames of divine love. Gold, beyond its obvious material value, symbolized the divine light that illuminated all creation. Purple, equally costly to produce, indicated imperial or divine authority. The seasonal rhythm of the monastery affected even the work of illumination. Winter months, with their longer nights and steadier indoor temperatures, were often preferred for the finest detail work. Spring brought fresh flowers and plants that could serve as models for marginalia. Summer's intense light could fade pigments and make gold leaf difficult to handle, while autumn provided the perfect conditions for beginning major new projects. Master illuminators like Brother Matthias often worked on multiple manuscripts simultaneously, allowing paint to dry on one while they progressed with another. This practice required exceptional organizational skills, as each project had to be carefully tracked and protected. Work surfaces were covered with silk cloths when not in use, and each manuscript was stored in specially constructed boxes that protected it from dust, light, and moisture. The collaboration between scribes and illuminators required careful coordination and mutual respect. Spaces for illuminated initials had to be left precisely the right size, and the scribe's text had to flow around decorative elements in a way that maintained both readability and artistic balance. Sometimes a project would pass back and forth between scribe and illuminator multiple times, as layers of text and decoration were built up together. The completion of a major illuminated manuscript was cause for celebration throughout the monastery. When Brother Matthias finally applied the last touches of gold to his Gospel of Matthew tiny highlights that made the angel's wings seem to flutter in candlelight, the entire community gathered to witness the unveiling. Here was not merely a book, but a work of art that would serve the liturgical needs of the monastery while inspiring wonder and devotion for generations to come. In the quiet hours after Compline, when the scriptorium lay empty and dark, these illuminated manuscripts rested in their protective coverings, their gold and colors waiting patiently for tomorrow's light. Each page represented not only countless hours of patient labor, but also the medieval conviction that the highest forms of human artistry should be dedicated to the glory of God and the preservation of sacred knowledge. Across the landscape of medieval Europe, certain monasteries rose to prominence not merely for their spiritual life or architectural grandeur, but for the extraordinary libraries they assembled and maintained. These institutions became beacons of learning, their collections drawing scholars from distant lands and their influence extending far beyond their cloister walls. The monastery of St. Gall, nestled in the hills of what is now Switzerland, developed one of the most remarkable libraries of the medieval world. Founded in the 7th century by the Irish monk Gallus, it grew under the careful stewardship of generations of scholar abbots who understood that the preservation of knowledge was itself a form of worship. By the 9th century, the library at St. Gall contained over 1,000 volumes, an almost unimaginable wealth of learning for its time. Brother Eckhard, who served as librarian at St. Gall during the early 10th century, could walk through his domain and point to manuscripts that told the story of European learning. Here was a copy of Virgil's Aeneid written in elegant Carolingian minuscule. There a collection of Frankish laws that had been copied for Charlemagne himself. Ancient medical texts shared shelf space with contemporary theological treatises, while musical manuscripts preserved the development of polyphonic singing that would transform medieval worship. The physical arrangement of the St. Gall Library reflected both practical needs and symbolic purposes. The most precious manuscripts illuminated gospel books, ancient classical texts, and unique historical documents were kept in a secure room called the Libraria, accessible only to the librarian and his most trusted assistants. Less valuable but frequently consulted works were housed in the main library hall, where monks could study at lecterns designed to support large volumes while protecting them from damage. The cataloguing system developed at St. Gall became a model for other monasteries throughout the region. Each manuscript was assigned a specific shelf location and described in a detailed catalogue that noted its contents, physical condition, and provenance. This systematic approach allowed librarians to locate specific texts quickly and to track the movement of volumes that were borrowed by other monasteries or traveling scholars. Monte Cassino, the mother house of the Benedictine order, maintained a library that reflected its foundational role in Western monasticism. Here, the Rule of Saint Benedict was preserved in its original form, along with an extensive collection of texts that documented the early history of monastic life. The library's strength lay particularly in theological and canonical texts, reflecting the monastery's role as a center of ecclesiastical authority. The scriptorium at Monte Cassino produced some of the finest manuscripts of the early medieval period, including copies of classical authors that would otherwise have been lost. The monastery's location along ancient trade routes connecting Rome with southern Italy allowed it to acquire texts from both Byzantine and Islamic scholars, creating a unique collection that bridged different intellectual traditions. Abbot Desiderius, who ruled Monte Cassino during the 11th century, oversaw a dramatic expansion of the library's holdings. Under his leadership, the monastery acquired manuscripts from Constantinople, copies of Greek medical and scientific texts that had been unknown in Western Europe for centuries. These acquisitions required not only considerable financial resources, but also the linguistic skills necessary to understand and preserve texts in languages that few Western monks could read. The island monastery of Reichenau, located in Lake Constance, developed a library renowned throughout Europe for its historical and liturgical manuscripts. The monks of Reichenau specialized in the production of chronicles and annals that preserved the political and ecclesiastical history of the Carolingian and Ettonian empires. Their careful documentation of contemporary events created historical sources that scholars still consult today. The Reichenau scriptorium was particularly famous for its illuminated manuscripts, which combined Germanic artistic traditions with influences from Byzantium and Italy. The monastery's location at the crossroads of European trade routes exposed its artists to diverse cultural influences, resulting in a distinctive artistic style that influenced manuscript production throughout the German-speaking regions. Brother Hermann the Lame, one of Reichenau's most distinguished scholars, exemplified the intellectual breadth that characterized the monastery's community. Despite physical disabilities that prevented him from participating in manual labor, Hermann became one of the leading mathematicians, astronomers, and historians of his age. His works on chronology and music theory were copied and studied in monasteries throughout Europe. The monastery of Cluny, mother house of the great monastic reform movement, assembled a library that reflected its spiritual and administrative authority over hundreds of dependent monasteries. The Cluniac emphasis on elaborate liturgical worship required an extensive collection of service books, while the order's involvement in ecclesiastical politics necessitated comprehensive legal and canonical libraries. Under Abbot Hugh of Cluny, the monastery's library expanded to include nearly 2,000 volumes, making it one of the largest collections in medieval Europe. The catalogue compiled during Hugh's abbacy reveals the extraordinary breadth of the collection, complete sets of the Church Fathers, extensive classical holdings, contemporary theological works, and specialized texts on canon law, liturgy, and monastic administration. The library at Cluny served not only the immediate monastic community, but also the network of dependent monasteries that looked to the mother house for guidance and resources. Manuscripts were regularly copied and distributed to daughter houses, ensuring that important texts were preserved in multiple locations and that standards of learning remained consistent throughout the Cluniac system. The English monastery of Canterbury, seat of the Archbishop and centre of English Christianity, developed a library that combined Anglo-Saxon traditions with continental learning. The collection included unique Anglo-Saxon manuscripts that preserved early English literature and history, alongside Latin texts that connected English scholarship with the broader European intellectual community. The Canterbury Scriptorium produced some of the most beautiful manuscripts of the medieval period, including psalters and gospel books that were renowned for their artistic excellence. The monastery's wealth, derived from extensive landholdings and royal patronage, allowed for the acquisition of the finest materials and the employment of the most skilled artisans. Archbishop Lanfranc, who reformed Canterbury in the late 11th century, oversaw a systematic expansion of the library's theological holdings. Under his direction, the monastery acquired complete sets of patristic literature and contemporary theological works from continental scholars. This expansion reflected Lanfranc's vision of Canterbury as an intellectual centre that could compete with the great schools of Paris and Rome. The monastery of Corbie, located in northern France, developed particular strength in classical literature and Carolingian historical texts. The Corbie scriptorium was renowned for the clarity and elegance of its script, which became a model for manuscript production throughout the Frankish realm. Many of our most important copies of classical authors Livy, Tacitus, and others survive only through the careful work of Corbie scribes. The library at Corbie reflected the monastery's position within the Carolingian intellectual renaissance. Under the patronage of Charlemagne and his successors, the monastery acquired texts from throughout the empire and beyond, creating a collection that represented the best of both classical and contemporary learning. These great monastery libraries were more than mere repositories of books. They were living institutions where knowledge was not only preserved but actively studied, discussed, and transmitted to new generations. The daily life of these communities revolved around the careful balance between prayer and learning that Saint Benedict had prescribed, with the library serving as the heart of intellectual activity. The influence of these collections extended far beyond their immediate communities. Scholars traveled from monastery to monastery, copying important texts and exchanging ideas. Networks of correspondence connected librarians across Europe, facilitating the movement of knowledge and ensuring that important discoveries or acquisitions were shared among the scholarly community. The preservation work carried out in these great libraries literally saved European civilization during periods of political upheaval, military invasion, and social collapse. The patient work of monastic scribes ensured that the intellectual heritage of Greece and Rome, combined with Christian learning, would survive to inspire future generations. The books that rested on their shelves represented not merely collections of texts, but the continuous thread of human knowledge stretching from antiquity to the future. In the quiet halls of these great libraries, surrounded by countless volumes that represented centuries of patient labor, medieval monks carried forward the essential work of civilization. Each manuscript was a victory against the forces of ignorance and forgetting. Each carefully copied page a bridge between past and future, ensuring that the light of learning would continue to illuminate the world for generations yet to come. In the hushed atmosphere of the monastery library, Father Columban moved with the reverent care of one who understood that each manuscript under his protection represented not merely bound parchment and ink, but centuries of accumulated human knowledge. As the keeper of the library at the Abbey of St. Denis, he bore responsibility for preserving texts that existed nowhere else in the world, treasures whose loss would create gaps in human understanding that could never be filled. The daily routine of manuscript conservation began before dawn, as Columban made his way through the library by candlelight, checking each storage area for signs of the enemies that constantly threatened his precious charges. Moisture was perhaps the greatest danger. Dampness that could cause parchment to curl and crack, inks to run, and the dreaded mold to take hold in bindings and pages. The thick stone walls of the monastery provided some protection, but constant vigilance was required. Each morning, Columban would examine the wooden lecterns and storage chests that housed the library's collection, running his experienced fingers along surfaces to detect any dampness that might have accumulated overnight. The placement of manuscripts within the library was itself a science work. Stored too near the windows might be damaged by direct sunlight, while those placed too deep in interior spaces might suffer from poor air circulation. The preparation of proper storage conditions required both practical knowledge and considerable resources. Wooden chests lined with silk or fine linen provided protection from dust and insects, while allowing air to circulate around stored manuscripts. These containers were often scented with herbs, lavender, rosemary, or wormwood that helped repel the insects that could devastate a collection in a matter of months. Brother Columban had learned his conservation techniques through years of apprenticeship under the previous librarian, but the knowledge itself stretched back through generations of careful observers who had noted which treatments preserved manuscripts and which hastened their destruction. This accumulated wisdom was as carefully guarded as the manuscripts themselves, passed down through an unbroken chain of dedicated keepers. The binding of manuscripts presented unique challenges for long-term preservation. The wooden boards that protected text blocks had to be properly seasoned to prevent warping, while the leather covering required regular treatment to maintain flexibility. Columban mixed his own leather dressing from rendered fat and beeswax, applying it sparingly to bindings that showed signs of cracking or stiffness. Metal clasps and chain attachments, while necessary for security, created their own conservation problems. Iron fittings could rust and stain parchment, while copper or brass might develop verdigris that could eat through nearby pages. Regular cleaning and the application of protective oils helped prevent these problems, but constant monitoring was essential. The repair of damaged manuscripts demanded skills that bordered on the artistic. When pages became torn or holes developed in parchment, Columban would carefully select matching pieces of vellum to serve as patches. These repairs had to be virtually invisible while providing lasting support for damaged areas. The process required extraordinary patience, first cleaning the damaged area, then preparing the patch with appropriate sizing, and finally attaching it with carefully prepared adhesives that would not discolor or deteriorate over time. Ink damage presented some of the most challenging conservation problems. Iron gall ink, the standard writing medium used in most manuscripts, had a tendency to become corrosive over time, eating through parchment and creating holes in the exact spots where text was written. When Columban discovered pages affected by ink corrosion, he would carefully treat them with solutions designed to neutralize the acid while strengthening the damaged parchment. The mixing of conservation materials was itself a complex art requiring knowledge of chemistry that had been accumulated through centuries of trial and error. Adhesives had to be strong enough to hold repairs permanently while remaining flexible enough not to crack with age. Size made from animal hide provided excellent adhesion, but could attract insects if not properly prepared. Plant-based adhesives offered alternatives, but presented their own challenges in terms of stability and permanence. Cleaning manuscripts required extraordinary care and considerable judgment. Dust and grime accumulated naturally over the years, but aggressive cleaning could damage delicate surfaces or remove original materials along with dirt. Columban used soft brushes made from sable or squirrel hair, working with the lightest possible touch to remove surface contamination without disturbing underlying materials. Water damage represented one of the most serious threats to manuscript collections. When leaks developed in monastery roofs or pipes burst during winter freezes, entire collections could be endangered within hours. The treatment of water-damaged manuscripts required immediate action. Pages had to be carefully separated and dried under controlled conditions to prevent cockling and mold growth. Brother Columban had developed techniques for salvaging manuscripts that other librarians might have considered beyond repair. Severely water-damaged books were carefully disbound, their pages separated and treated individually. Each sheet was placed between absorbent materials and weighted lightly to prevent distortion as it dried. The process might take weeks or even months, but the alternative was the total loss of irreplaceable texts. The prevention of pest damage required constant vigilance and a thorough understanding of the insects and rodents that threatened manuscript collections. Book lice, silverfish, and various species of beetles could destroy years of careful copying in a matter of weeks if left unchecked. Columban inspected his collection regularly for signs of pest activity, tiny holes in parchment, small piles of debris, or the insects themselves. Traditional pest control methods relied heavily on aromatic plants and careful environmental management. Cedar chests naturally repelled many insects, while sachets of dried herbs placed among stored manuscripts provided additional protection. The monastery's cats served an important role in controlling rodent populations that might otherwise gnaw on leather bindings or build nests in stored manuscripts. Temperature fluctuations posed another significant threat to manuscript preservation. Rapid changes in temperature could cause parchment to expand and contract, leading to cracking and distortion. The thick walls and small windows of monastery libraries helped moderate these fluctuations, but careful attention to heating and ventilation was still required. The copying of deteriorating manuscripts represented perhaps the most important aspect of long-term preservation. When Brother Columban identified a manuscript whose condition was declining beyond repair, he would arrange for a new copy to be made before the original became illegible. These conservation copies were prepared with special care, as they would serve as the primary text for future generations. The selection of materials for conservation work required the same attention to quality that governed original manuscript production. Parchment used for repairs had to match the original as closely as possible in thickness, texture, and color. Inks used for touching up faded text had to be chemically compatible with original materials while providing the permanence necessary for long-term preservation. Record keeping formed an essential part of manuscript conservation. Columban maintained detailed notes on the condition of each manuscript in his care, tracking repairs, treatments, and changes over time. These records allowed him to identify patterns of deterioration and develop more effective preservation strategies. The training of assistants in conservation techniques was crucial for ensuring the continuation of preservation work. Young monks assigned to library duties learn not only how to handle manuscripts properly, but also how to recognize signs of deterioration and perform basic conservation treatments. This knowledge was transmitted through hands-on training and careful supervision, creating a continuous tradition of preservation expertise. Environmental monitoring, though lacking modern instruments, was conducted through careful observation and the accumulated experience of generations of librarians. Columban could predict weather changes by watching how parchment and leather responded to atmospheric conditions, adjusting storage and handling procedures accordingly. The philosophical approach to manuscript conservation reflected deeper monastic values about the nature of knowledge and human responsibility. Each manuscript was seen as a sacred trust, a responsibility that extended beyond the immediate community to future generations who would depend on these texts for their own learning and spiritual development. In the quiet evening hours, when the library lay peaceful under the protection of darkness, Brother Columban would make his final rounds, checking that each precious volume was secure in its proper place. His daily work of preservation continued the essential mission of monasticism, ensuring that the light of knowledge would continue to shine through whatever darkness might come, protected by the patient care of those who understood that some treasures are worth any sacrifice to preserve. Within the peaceful confines of medieval monasteries, education unfolded at a pace as measured and deliberate as the copying of manuscripts themselves. The monastery school, typically housed in buildings adjacent to the library and scriptorium, served as one of the few sources of formal learning available in early medieval Europe its influence extending far beyond the cloister walls to shape the intellectual development of an entire civilization. Brother Anselm, who had served as schoolmaster at the Abbey of Beessy for nearly 2 decades, understood that his role encompassed far more than simple instruction in reading and writing. Each young oblate who entered his care, whether destined for monastic life or secular service, would carry forward the intellectual traditions that had been preserved and refined through centuries of patient scholarship. The monastery school typically operated at two distinct levels, reflecting both the practical needs of the community and the broader educational mission that monasteries had inherited from the classical world. The elementary school, known as the Scholar Interior, served the young oblates who had been dedicated to monastic life by their families. Here, boys as young as 7 years old began their introduction to the world of learning that would define their adult lives. The day began, like all monastic activities, with prayer. The young students, their voices high and clear in the morning air, joined their elders in the chapel for lauds before making their way to the schoolroom. The building itself was designed for learning. Large windows admitted maximum light for reading, while thick walls provided the quiet atmosphere necessary for concentration. The curriculum of the monastery school was built upon the foundation of the trivium grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic, supplemented by the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. These 7 liberal arts, inherited from classical antiquity, formed the core of medieval education and provided students with the intellectual tools necessary for advanced study in theology and philosophy. Grammar, the first and most fundamental of these subjects, began with the mastery of Latin, the universal language of learning and worship. Young students spent countless hours memorizing Latin vocabulary, declining nouns, and conjugating verbs. The textbooks they used works by Donatus and Priscian that had been copied and recopied for centuries provided systematic instruction in the structure and usage of the language that would serve them throughout their lives. Brother Anselm employed teaching methods that had been refined through generations of monastic education. Students learned through repetition and recitation, their voices joining in unison as they chanted grammatical rules or memorized passages from classical authors. The monastery's collection of manuscripts served as both textbook and reference library, with students gradually gaining access to more advanced texts as their skills developed. The teaching of reading began with the most basic texts, simple prayers and psalms that students already knew by heart from participating in monastic worship. This approach allowed young learners to associate familiar sounds with unfamiliar written symbols, gradually building the connection between spoken and written language that forms the foundation of literacy. Writing instruction followed a similarly systematic approach. Students began by practicing letter formation on wax tablets that could be smoothed and reused countless times. Only when their hand was steady and their letters properly formed were they permitted to work with ink and parchment materials too precious to be wasted on novice attempts. The scriptorium itself served as an advanced classroom where older students learned the practical skills of manuscript production. Under careful supervision, they practiced the preparation of parchment, the cutting of pens, and the mixing of inks. The most promising students might eventually be allowed to copy simple texts, gradually developing the speed and accuracy necessary for professional scribal work. Rhetoric, the second component of the trivium, taught students the art of effective communication through both speech and writing. Using classical texts by Cicero and Quintilian, Brother Anselm instructed his pupils in the construction of logical arguments and the elegant expression of complex ideas. These skills were essential not only for theological study, but also for the practical administration that would occupy much of their adult lives. The study of dialectic logic and reasoning prepared students for the intellectual challenges they would face in advanced theological study. Using works by Aristotle and Boethius, students learned to construct syllogisms, identify logical fallacies, and engage in the kind of systematic reasoning that would characterize medieval scholastic thought. The quadrivium introduced students to mathematical and scientific knowledge that complemented their literary and rhetorical training. Arithmetic, taught through works by Boethius and other classical authors, provided the computational skills necessary for monastery administration and the calculation of dates for religious festivals. Geometry, studied through Latin translations of Euclid, offered training in logical proof and spatial reasoning that found practical application in architecture and astronomy. Students learned to construct geometric figures using compass and straightedge, developing the mathematical intuition that would serve them in various fields of study. Astronomy occupied a particularly important place in the monastic curriculum because of its practical applications in determining the proper dates for Easter and other religious celebrations. Students learned to use astronomical tables, calculate the movements of celestial bodies, and construct calendars that coordinated lunar and solar cycles. Music, the final component of the quadrivium, was studied both as mathematical theory and practical art. Students learned the mathematical ratios that governed musical intervals, while also developing the singing skills necessary for participation in monastic worship. The development of musical notation during this period transformed music from an oral tradition into a written art that could be studied and preserved like any other text. The monastery school also provided practical training that reflected the immediate needs of the monastic community. Students learned basic skills in agriculture, crafts, and administration that would allow them to contribute to the economic life of the monastery. This combination of theoretical knowledge and practical training created graduates who were prepared for leadership roles both within and outside the monastic community. The external school, known as the schola exteria, served students who were not destined for monastic life, but whose families sought the educational advantages that only monasteries could provide. These students, often the sons of local nobility or wealthy merchants, received instruction alongside the oblates, but returned to secular life after completing their studies. The interaction between monastic and secular students created a dynamic learning environment that benefited both groups. Secular students brought knowledge of the outside world into the monastery school, while monastic students shared the deep spiritual and intellectual traditions of their community. This exchange helped ensure that monastic learning remained connected to broader social and cultural developments. Brother Anselm's teaching methods reflected centuries of pedagogical experience adapted to the specific needs of medieval society. He understood that his students would face challenges that required not only intellectual knowledge, but also moral wisdom and practical judgment. The integration of learning and spiritual development that characterized monastic education produced graduates who were prepared for leadership in both church and state. The library played a central role in the educational program, serving as both resource and inspiration for students at all levels. Beginning students might be permitted to examine simple texts under careful supervision, while advanced pupils gained increasing access to the monastery's collection. The physical presence of hundreds of manuscripts provided tangible evidence of the intellectual heritage that students were being invited to join. Assessment of student progress was based on practical demonstration rather than formal examinations. Students proved their mastery of grammar by accurately copying complex texts, demonstrated their rhetorical skills through participation in disputations, and showed their mathematical competence by solving practical problems related to monastery administration. The graduation of students from the monastery school marked not just the completion of formal education, but the beginning of a lifetime of learning. Whether they remained within the monastic community or returned to secular life, graduates carried with them the intellectual tools and scholarly habits that would allow them to continue their education independently. The influence of monastery schools extended far beyond their immediate graduates. These institutions served as centers of educational innovation, developing new teaching methods and preserving classical pedagogical traditions. The masters who taught in these schools often became correspondents and advisors to other educational institutions, spreading effective practices throughout the medieval world. In the quiet hours of evening study, when students gathered in the library to review the day's lessons, Brother Anselm could see the fruits of the educational tradition he served. Here were young minds being shaped by the same texts and methods that had educated scholars for centuries, prepared to carry forward the intellectual heritage that made civilized life possible. The gentle rhythm of learning that governed the monastery school ensured that knowledge would be transmitted not just accurately, but with the wisdom and understanding that could only come from patient, careful instruction guided by those who understood that education was itself a sacred trust. As the 12th century dawned across medieval Europe, subtle changes began to stir in the quiet world of monastery libraries. The changes came slowly at first, like the gradual shift of seasons, barely perceptible to those who lived within the daily rhythms of monastic life. Brother Aldrich, now an elderly keeper of books at the Abbey of Cluny, had witnessed the beginning of transformations that would eventually reshape the entire landscape of medieval learning. The rise of cathedral schools in urban centers represented one of the most significant challenges to the monastic monopoly on education and scholarship. Cities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford were developing institutions of learning that attracted students and masters from across Europe, offering a different model of intellectual life that emphasized debate, innovation, and connection to the broader world of commerce and politics. The Cathedral School of Notre Dame in Paris, under the leadership of masters like Peter Abelard, drew students who might once have sought education in monastery schools. These urban institutions offered something that monastic education, with its emphasis on contemplation and established authority, could not provide. Intellectual excitement, controversial debates, and direct engagement with contemporary philosophical and theological questions. Brother Aldrich had observed the gradual departure of some of his brightest students, young men who completed their basic education in the monastery but then traveled to Paris or other centers to pursue advanced studies. They returned, when they returned at all, with ideas and methods that sometimes sat uneasily with traditional monastic approaches to learning. The development of scholastic method, with its emphasis on systematic questioning and logical analysis, represented both an opportunity and a threat to monastic intellectual traditions. While some monasteries embraced these new approaches, others found them incompatible with the contemplative spirituality that had always characterized monastic learning. The growth of urban book production created another challenge to the traditional role of monastery scriptoriums. Professional scribes working in cities could produce manuscripts more quickly and often more cheaply than monastic scriptoriums, where copying was balanced against other religious duties. The development of new writing materials, particularly paper made from rags, offered alternatives to the expensive parchment that had long made manuscript production a luxury craft. Economic pressures also began to affect monastery libraries as the feudal system that had supported monastic communities for centuries started to evolve. The growth of commerce and the rise of money-based economies created new forms of wealth that sometimes bypassed traditional ecclesiastical institutions. Wealthy merchants and urban nobles began to create their own libraries, commissioning manuscripts directly from commercial scriptoriums rather than relying on monastic production. The Crusades, beginning in the late 11th century, brought new challenges and opportunities to monastery libraries. While these military expeditions created political disruption and drew resources away from scholarly pursuits, they also opened new channels for the transmission of knowledge. Manuscripts and ideas that had been preserved in Byzantine and Islamic libraries began to flow westward, bringing texts that had been unknown in Western Europe for centuries. The translation movement, centered in places like Toledo and Sicily, made available Greek and Arabic works on philosophy, science, and medicine that challenged and supplemented the traditional curriculum of monastery schools. Works by Aristotle, previously known only through brief summaries, became available in complete translations that revolutionized the study of logic and natural philosophy. Brother Aldrich found himself struggling to keep pace with these new developments. His library's collection of traditional texts, the Church Fathers, classical Latin authors, and basic scientific works suddenly seemed incomplete when compared to the vast new body of translated material that was transforming scholarship in urban centers. The administrative demands of large monastic organizations also began to compete with scholarly activities for the time and attention of educated monks. The Cluniac reform movement, while successful in revitalizing monastic life, created complex administrative structures that required extensive correspondence and record-keeping. Monks who might once have devoted their time to copying manuscripts found themselves occupied with legal documents, financial records, and administrative correspondence. The growth of monastic wealth, paradoxically, created its own problems for scholarly life. Successful monasteries became major landowners and economic powers, requiring sophisticated management that drew the most capable monks away from intellectual pursuits. The daily administration of vast estates, the supervision of agricultural production, and the management of dependent communities left little time for the patient work of manuscript copying and preservation. Political conflicts between church and state created additional pressures on monastic communities. The investiture controversy, which raged throughout the 11th and early 12th centuries, forced monasteries to choose sides in conflicts that could affect their survival. Libraries that had developed over centuries could be lost overnight if their monasteries chose the losing side in political disputes. The reform movements within monasticism itself sometimes created tensions with traditional scholarly activities. New orders like the Cistercians, while deeply committed to spiritual renewal, often viewed the elaborate manuscripts and extensive libraries of traditional Benedictine monasteries as signs of worldly corruption rather than spiritual achievement. The Cistercian emphasis on simplicity and manual labor left less room for the scholarly activities that had flourished in traditional Benedictine communities. While Cistercian monasteries maintained libraries, they tended to be smaller and more focused on purely religious texts, eschewing the classical and secular works that had been preserved in older monastic collections. Brother Aldrich witnessed the gradual shift in recruitment patterns that affected many traditional monasteries. The sons of noble families who had once been dedicated to monastic life as oblates increasingly chose other paths: university education, military service, or administrative careers in emerging bureaucratic states. The intellectual quality of monastic communities began to reflect these changing patterns of recruitment. The development of new forms of religious life, particularly the mendicant orders founded by Francis of Assisi and Dominique de Gamen, created alternatives to traditional monasticism that appealed to many who sought religious vocation. These new orders, with their emphasis on preaching and pastoral care, developed different relationships with learning and scholarship that sometimes competed with monastic approaches. The Dominican order, in particular, established its own educational institutions and libraries that rivaled those of traditional monasteries. The Dominican Studium Generale in Paris became a center of scholastic theology that attracted some of the brightest minds of the 13th century, offering an alternative to monastic approaches to religious learning. Technological innovations, particularly in manuscript production, began to change the economics of book creation in ways that affected monastery scriptoriums. The development of more efficient copying methods, standardized scripts, and improved organizational techniques allowed commercial scriptoriums to produce manuscripts at unprecedented speeds and volumes. The gradual introduction of mechanical devices improved presses for binding, better cutting tools for parchment preparation, and more efficient methods for preparing inks and pigments created competitive advantages for commercial producers that traditional monastery scriptoriums found difficult to match. Natural disasters and political upheavals continued to threaten manuscript collections, but the changing political landscape of medieval Europe sometimes made recovery more difficult. The growth of centralized monarchies created new forms of political instability, while the development of more sophisticated military techniques made monasteries more vulnerable to destruction. The library at Monte Cassino, which had survived barbarian invasions and earthquakes, faced new threats from Norman armies and papal imperial conflicts that could destroy in days what had been built over centuries. The increasing scale and sophistication of medieval warfare made no institution, no matter how venerable, completely safe from destruction. Climate change during this period, including what historians call the medieval warm period, created both opportunities and challenges for monastery libraries. Improved agricultural productivity supported larger communities and provided resources for scholarly activities. But changing weather patterns also created new preservation challenges for manuscript collections. Despite these challenges, many monastery libraries adapted successfully to changing circumstances. Some embraced new forms of scholarship while maintaining their traditional roles as centers of learning and preservation. Others specialized in particular areas of knowledge, becoming centers of excellence that attracted scholars from throughout Europe. The monastery of Chartres, for example, developed particular strength in mathematical and scientific studies, while maintaining its traditional theological and philosophical collections. The school of Chartres became famous throughout Europe for its innovative approaches to natural philosophy that combined traditional Christian learning with newly available Aristotelian texts. Brother Aldrich, in his final years as librarian, came to understand that the changes he witnessed were not necessarily signs of decline, but rather evidence of the success of the monastic scholarly tradition. The learning that had been preserved and transmitted through centuries of patient monastic labor was now spreading throughout European society, taking new forms and finding new expressions while maintaining its essential continuity with the past. The quiet revolution that was transforming medieval intellectual life represented not the end of monastic scholarship, but its diffusion throughout a society that was itself becoming more literate, more sophisticated, and more capable of supporting diverse forms of learning. The monastery libraries that had served as arks of knowledge during the darkest centuries of the early medieval period had succeeded in their essential mission. They had preserved and transmitted the intellectual heritage of the ancient world, while nurturing new forms of Christian scholarship that would shape European civilization for centuries to come. In the fading light of a winter afternoon, Brother Benedict walked slowly through the ancient library of his monastery, his footsteps echoing softly in the vaulted hall that had housed manuscripts for nearly 5 centuries. As the last keeper of books in this venerable institution, he carried within his memory not only the location of every volume on these shelves, but also the stories of the countless monks who had devoted their lives to preserving the written word. The transformation of European intellectual life that had begun in the 12th century was now complete. Universities flourished in every major city. Printing presses were beginning to multiply books at unprecedented rates, and the Renaissance had brought new approaches to learning that sometimes seemed to render the patient methods of monastic scholarship obsolete. Yet Brother Benedict understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that the new world of learning rested upon foundations laid by generations of monks who had worked in silence and obscurity to preserve the treasures of human knowledge. The impact of medieval monastery libraries extended far beyond the simple preservation of texts, though that achievement alone would justify their historical importance. These institutions had created the intellectual infrastructure that made possible the flowering of medieval scholasticism. The Renaissance recovery of classical learning, and ultimately the scientific revolution that would transform human understanding of the natural world. Every major university in Europe could trace its intellectual lineage back to monastery schools and libraries. The University of Paris, which had emerged from the Cathedral School of Notre Dame, relied heavily on manuscript collections that had been copied and preserved in monastic scriptoriums throughout France. The scholars who gathered in Paris to debate questions of theology and philosophy used texts that existed only because monks had devoted their lives to copying and preserving them. The scholastic method itself, with its careful citation of authorities and systematic comparison of different sources, reflected techniques that had been developed in monastery libraries over centuries of patient scholarship. The great theological syntheses of Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus were built upon textual foundations that had been established by generations of monastic scholars who understood that knowledge could only be advanced through careful attention to the written record of human learning. Brother Benedict had witnessed the arrival of printed books in his monastery's library, those mechanical productions that could reproduce texts with perfect accuracy and unprecedented speed. Yet he also understood what was being lost in this technological revolution, the intimate connection between scribe and text that had characterized manuscript culture, the careful attention to individual words and phrases that came from copying them by hand, the sense of personal participation in the transmission of knowledge that had made each monk not merely a copyist, but a guardian of learning. The artistic achievement of medieval manuscript illumination had created visual traditions that continued to influence European art long after the decline of monastic scriptoriums. The decorative techniques developed by monastic illuminators found their way into panel painting, architectural decoration, and even the early products of printing presses, which often imitated the appearance of illuminated manuscripts. The Gothic revival movement of the 18th and 19th centuries would rediscover the artistic treasures of medieval manuscripts, inspiring new appreciation for the patient craftsmanship that had created these works. Museums throughout Europe and America would compete to acquire illuminated manuscripts that represented not only historical documents, but works of art whose beauty and spiritual power continue to move viewers centuries after their creation. The cataloging and organizational systems developed in medieval monastery libraries provided models for later library science that remained influential well into the modern period. The careful attention to provenance, condition, and content that characterized monastic library management established principles of bibliographic control that would be refined and expanded, but never fundamentally altered. The concept of the library as a public trust, serving not only immediate users, but future generations of scholars, had its origins in monastic approaches to manuscript preservation. The sense of stewardship that governed monastic libraries, the understanding that books were not merely possessions but sacred trusts to be preserved for posterity, established ethical foundations for library service that continue to influence professional practice today. Brother Benedict often reflected on the global impact of the knowledge that had been preserved in European monastery libraries. The classical texts that monks had copied during the darkest centuries of the early medieval period had eventually made their way to scholars throughout the Islamic world and beyond, contributing to scientific and philosophical developments that transcended religious and cultural boundaries. The translation movement that had brought Greek and Arabic texts into Latin during the 12th and 13th centuries represented a culmination of the preservation work that had been carried out in monastery libraries for centuries. Without the foundation of Latin scholarship that monks had maintained, European scholars would have been unable to absorb and build upon the scientific and philosophical achievements of other civilizations. The Renaissance recovery of classical antiquity was possible only because monastic scribes had preserved the texts that humanist scholars would rediscover and celebrate. The plays of Terence, the histories of Livy, The philosophical works of Cicero all had survived the collapse of the ancient world because monks understood their value and devoted their lives to copying and preserving them. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries drew upon observational and logical methods that had been preserved in classical texts copied by monastic scribes. The works of Aristotle on natural philosophy, Ptolemy on astronomy, and Galen on medicine provided starting points for scientific investigation that would eventually surpass, but never entirely abandon, the knowledge of antiquity. The exploration of the New World carried with it the intellectual framework that had been preserved and refined in monastery libraries, the geographical knowledge preserved in classical texts, the theological concepts developed by medieval scholars, and the educational methods refined in monastic schools all played roles in shaping European responses to the discovery of previously unknown continents and civilizations. Brother Benedict understood that the monastery library as an institution had evolved rather than simply disappeared. The great national libraries of Europe, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the British Library in London, the Vatican Library in Rome, all trace their origins and methods back to medieval monastic libraries. The principles of collection, development, preservation, and service that governed these modern institutions reflected centuries of monastic library practice. The tradition of scholarly correspondence that connected medieval monastery libraries had evolved into the international scholarly community that characterized modern academic life. The networks of communication that allowed monks to share discoveries and exchange texts had provided the model for scholarly collaboration that would eventually span continents and transform human understanding of virtually every field of knowledge. The educational mission of monastery libraries lived on in the library systems of universities throughout the world. The integration of library resources with educational programs, the emphasis on developing information literacy skills, and the commitment to serving both current students and future scholars all reflected principles that had been established in medieval monastic institutions. As evening approached and the last light faded from the ancient windows, Brother Benedict made his final rounds through the library that had been his life's work. Each manuscript on these shelves represented not merely a text, but a link in the chain of transmission that connected the ancient world with the modern age. The patient work of countless monks had ensured that the wisdom of the past would continue to inform and inspire the future. The silence that pervaded the monastery library was not the silence of death or abandonment, but the silence of completion, the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished through centuries of dedicated labor. The books that rested on these shelves had fulfilled their purpose by nurturing the growth of human knowledge, by inspiring new forms of learning, and by demonstrating that the careful preservation of wisdom was itself a form of worship. In the great chain of human learning that connected Aristotle with Aquinas, Augustine with Abelard, and Boethius with the scholars of the Renaissance, the monastery libraries of medieval Europe had served as essential links. Their patient guardianship of the written word had made possible intellectual achievements that would have been impossible without the foundation of preserved knowledge they provided. The legacy of these institutions extended beyond any particular text or collection to encompass the entire tradition of scholarship that they had fostered. The commitment to learning, the reverence for books, the understanding that knowledge was a sacred trust, these values had been embodied in monastery libraries and transmitted through them to subsequent generations of scholars and students. As Brother Benedict extinguished the last lamp and made his way to Compline, the final prayer of the day, he carried with him the satisfaction of those who had served something greater than themselves. The monastery library would endure in memory and influence long after its physical books had crumbled to dust. Its essential mission accomplished through the patient work of those who understood that preserving the past was the most precious gift they could offer to the future. In the darkness that settled over the ancient monastery, the books rested in their quiet majesty, guardians of secrets and wisdom that had traveled across centuries to reach this moment. Their silence spoke of dedication rewarded, of missions completed, and of the eternal human desire to preserve and transmit the accumulated wisdom of ages. The monastery library had served its purpose in the great work of civilization, ensuring that the light of knowledge would never be extinguished, no matter what darkness might come. Thus concludes our journey through the quiet halls of medieval monastery libraries, where patience and devotion transformed simple ink and parchment into treasures that would illuminate the world for centuries to come. In these sacred spaces, the preservation of knowledge became a form of prayer, and the patient work of countless scribes ensured that the wisdom of ages would survive to inspire and inform future generations. May their example of dedication and service continue to guide all who serve as guardians of human learning.